Ready to welcome everybody. And we're starting our webinar today. Hello, everybody who is joining us. Thank you so much for doing so. Welcome to the Texas-Mexico Center. My name is Jenny Purdy. I am the director, and it's my pleasure to welcome you today. We're going to have a very exciting webinar on migration, which is one of the key areas of the center. If you're joining us for the first time, the Texas-Mexico Center is a public policy and research center dedicated to bettering the relationship both between Texas and Mexico and the US and Mexico. And we do that through research and public policy recommendations in 5 key areas: education, the border, trade, and of course, our main topic today, I'm going to leave that till last. Oh, sorry, I got distracted. And of course, we do migration, which is what our guests are going to speak to us about today. And let me introduce you to them. I know that you are eager to listen to them. Before we do that, let me just quick reminder for everybody. There is a Q&A section at the bottom of your screen here in this webinar mode. So if you have questions, there'll be time for Q&A. Write them in, and our speakers will start selecting those towards the end of the program. But it's my pleasure to introduce you today to our fabulous speakers. I'll start by introducing our senior fellow and also VP and senior economist at the Dallas Federal Reserve, Pia Orrenius. Welcome, Pia. Our research fellow and professor of economics at the University of North Florida, Madeline Zavodny. Welcome, Madeline. And we're also joined today by Jishen Su, senior research economist at the Dallas Federal Reserve. Welcome to the Texas-Mexico Center. Welcome, everybody, and thank you for this wonderful webinar today.
Thank you so much, Jenny. So we're all really excited to be here today to talk with you all about how Texas migration patterns have changed. And I just want to say, thank you very much to SMU Mission Foods Texas-Mexico Center for sponsoring this research. And also thanks to our special guest, Yichen Xu, for joining us today. He'll provide comments at the end. He's an urban economist who is a specialist in many of the topics that we're going to talk about, as well as the most recent migrant amongst us to Texas. So maybe he'll provide some thoughts on that as well. All right. What Pia and I are going to discuss today is some results from a report that we recently did for the Mission Food Center that updates a report that we wrote for them 2 years ago. It also ties in with some of our other work on international and domestic migration that you'll see as we go. All right, so with that, let's go ahead and get started. And don't forget that you can always put questions in the Q&A, and Pia's in charge of checking them right now, and we'll return to them later. All right, so we're going to begin with an overview of migration trends in the pandemic, focusing, of course, on Texas, but also thinking a little bit about what happened for the country as a whole. And in particular, what happened to states that Texas is commonly compared to the other big states of Florida, New York, and California. All right, so the first thing is to think a little bit about what happened to net migration, which is inflows, people moving into Texas, minus outflows, people leaving Texas either for other states or in and out of the country as well. This is both domestic and international net migration. What happened within Texas over the last decade plus. So the interesting thing to see here, I think, is the huge upsurge that occurred between 20 and 2021. Right. We would have to go back to 2005, Pia reminded me yesterday, to see a number that tops the near record high that Texas posted for its total net migration in 2022. So if you remember what happened in 2005, of course, was Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans led to lots of people moving, in particular to the Houston area. So what Texas experienced last year and over the last 2 years really has been really strong in migration. So when you step back and think about why this upsurge, particularly in the last year or so, we can think that Texas was positioned to do really well during the pandemic once people started moving. Right, of course, people initially sort of, in many cases, froze in place during the pandemic. But once people started moving, you could think, well, Texas would do really well because of affordable housing, right? It has a really pro-business climate. The lack of a state income tax is a big draw for Texas and Florida. And perhaps the relatively easy early easing of lockdowns in Texas also was attractive to some people. But on the other hand, you could think that particularly in 2020, 2021, international borders were closed. And again, a lot of people weren't moving. Some people just froze in place. So since Texas usually benefits in particular from international migration, we might not have expected to see the increase that Texas experienced in 2018 and 2019 continue into 2020, 2021, and then this huge upsurge in 2022. So I think that, we kind of went into this not knowing what to expect to see. Maybe you didn't know either, but this is what Texas actually saw. It gets even more interesting, I think, when we start to break it down between domestic net migration, so people coming to Texas from other states, minus those going to other states, and then the international net migration, so people coming to Texas from abroad, minus those leaving Texas to abroad. And I should mention all of these are estimates coming from the Census Bureau. You can always go and find their data there. Right, so what's interesting here, I think, is what happened in 2020 and 2021, is that there's a pretty noticeable drop here in international net migration, shown in red. So most years going back, Texas is gaining lots of residents from both domestic and international migration. And in a typical year, it's almost kind of close to 50-50, right? Then in 2020 and 2021, we see, maybe not surprisingly, international net migration really shrink. What's really interesting is that domestic net migration steps up and fills the gap for Texas. So in total, Texas continues to grow through migration. And if anything, it's stronger in 2020 and 2021. And again, this is really due to domestic net migration filling this gap that we might not have expected that to happen. Then in 2022, things get really interesting, right? We continue to see in Texas people moving there on net, and then a huge resurgence of international inflows back to levels that Texas hadn't seen in quite a few years. Okay. The next thing is to think, just kind of focus in on those recent years. And examine these trends just a little bit more closely. Right, so we see this big upsurge in the domestic net migration. And this really shows how international net migration had been falling in recent years in Texas. It was still positive, but really slowing, starting even as far back as 2015, 2016. So again, that surge that has occurred over the last year really pops out here. Okay. Just an interesting factoid coming from our report, which of course all of you should go and read online later, is that in 2021 to 2022, migration between domestic and international accounted for 3/4 of population growth in Texas. Now, looking back over the last decade, it's typical that about half of Texas's population growth is coming from a combination of domestic and international net migration. So in this last year, we've had really these big inflows that Texas experienced have really contributed to population growth. Of course, the other source of population growth is natural population growth, births minus deaths, right? And so that contribution of that to Texas's population growth was smaller over the last year. The next thing that Pia and I did for the report was to go through and switch our data source a little bit and look at what's called the American Community Survey. What's nice about this data is it allows us to break out the in-migration to Texas from the out-migration. So the earlier slides were showing the net migration, the in minus the out, which is always positive for Texas. But there might be interesting differences between how many people are moving in and how many people are moving out. So this is showing us that. Now, one limitation is we can really only look at this domestically because it's somewhat harder to track, of course, who's leaving the country. The American Community Survey doesn't survey those people because it's done in American communities. But so this is showing the domestic numbers for Texas. I think there's a couple of really interesting things that occur here. The first one is to see this drop from 2019 to 2020 in both in-migration and out-migration. And in particular for in-migration, it's a sharper drop. And this relates back to something I mentioned earlier about people really freezing in place early in the pandemic. Right? That a lot of people weren't quite sure what they wanted to do. Maybe they didn't feel safe to move. And so we really see this slowing in Texas in migration and a little bit of continued slowing in Texas out migration as well. Then between 2020 and 2021, we continue to see relatively low out migration from Texas, but we see a resurgence in Texas in migration from domestic sources. So lots more people moving to Texas from other states. Unfortunately, we don't yet have the 2022 data for Texas, but we could expect to continue to see a lot of these same patterns, right? Since we know from the overall census numbers that Texas was growing. One other interesting factoid that we share in the report is that this out-migration rate for Texas is truly eye-popping on a national basis. We talk about how Texas is the stickiest state most years. Most people born in Texas stay there, more so than for any other state. And most years, Texas has the lowest out-migration rate overall. So once people move to Texas, they tend to stay. The next thing that we do in the report is that we begin to compare Texas with some other big states. So as I mentioned earlier, we compare it to Florida, California, and New York. So these are the other really populous states. And they also, like Texas, have some big urban centers and then people living in all kinds of different rural and suburban areas, much like Texas does. So this one is showing us the domestic net migration numbers. And so one thing that's really interesting is here we start to see some negative numbers. So this horizontal line 0. California and New York for the entire period that we're focusing on in the report have been on net losing people to other states. So Yi-Chen was part of this, indeed, that he left California for Texas, as I recall, in around 2018. Right? So Florida and Texas are up above. They're on net gaining from other states. And Florida, which has a smaller population than Texas, has a higher rate. And it kind of gained in its lead a little bit here between 2021 and 2022. Lots of people moving to the Sunshine State, but also lots of people continuing to move to Texas from other states as well. So that's the domestic picture for these big states. When we look at the international picture, things look pretty different. So this is net international migration estimates coming from the Census Bureau, where they try to estimate not only how many people are moving in, but also how many people are moving out, unlike the American Community Survey that I mentioned earlier. One thing to note is that these data are combining all international migrants as well as being a net number. So this is legal and unauthorized immigrants, permanent and temporary. Everyone is together in these estimates. And maybe later, if people are interested, we could speculate some on breaking out some different groups, but that is somewhat speculative. All right, what's interesting here to notice in particular is that the big states all kind of tend to move a little bit together. Florida, in part because of its proximity to the Caribbean, tends to just have a higher net international migration number. And then we see from at least 2016, a drop for most of the states, right? So that even before Trump came into office, there was a slowing in international migration, largely due to fewer inflows as opposed to more outflows. Then we also see for all 4 of the big states here, this huge surge between 2021 and 2022. California is the only state among these 4 big states that had an increase from 2020 to 2021. So I think that that's somewhat interesting to think about. So of course, this is the Texas Mexico Center. So we don't want to just talk about Texas. We also want to talk a little bit about Mexico. So this is showing in-migration estimates from the American Community Survey from Mexico, looking at the rest of the United States and at Texas. And so it's just sort of more interesting to see what these look like. These only go through 2021. If we could think about what might be happening in 2022, is we would expect these numbers to be even stronger, right? We see the COVID drop that we would expect from 2019 to 2020, little bit of a rebound happening over 2020 to 2021. And again, we would expect this to continue to have really surged as the borders have begun reopening. All right, so that's a very big overview of trends of in and out migration, domestic and international. We also discussed in the report reasons why people have moved and how it looks like these have changed during the pandemic. So the first thing that I want to show you is this chart, which is data from the current population survey's annual social and economic supplement. So these data are usually collected in March of every year. So as you can imagine, for 2020, that must have been a very interesting collection time. The sample is smaller because it's really just 1 month of the current population survey. That makes the numbers for Texas here a little bit noisy. So, but despite that small sample, I think that there are some eye-popping trends that happened, or at least some eye-popping changes that occurred in 2021. So at the very end here. And it's these changes in the reason for moving to Texas. So these are in-migrants. They're coming from other states that we're looking at here. And we're looking at what reason people gave as their main reason for moving. What you see that's really interesting, I think, is this big increase in family-related moves, a continuing increase in housing-related moves, and then a drop in work-related moves. The other is sort of a catch-all category where it's a little bit harder to know what to think about that. Now, these patterns for Texas, I think, fit with a lot of national trends of if you move during this period, the reasons why you were moving in many cases were changing. Maybe you were moving to be near family members who you thought were at risk, or you lost your job or you had remote schooling and therefore were moving home to be with family members. And of course, we know that housing markets have undergone tremendous change over the last couple of years. So it's not a big surprise to see lots of housing related moves, particularly to a state that has relatively low housing costs compared with a lot of other big states. Another interesting way in which Texas really fits with national trends is what I think a lot of economists are calling the donut effect. So this is that people are heading to the suburbs and avoiding urban cores. What the blue line here is among people moving to Texas, how many are going to the top 4 Texas metro areas? Those are, of course, Houston, Dallas, Fort Worth, Austin, and San Antonio. Well, that's remained kind of roughly constant, maybe a slow upward drift over time. What's really changed is the percent of top 4 movers who are moving to the central city. And you were seeing an upswing in that from 2018 to 2020. Then look what happened. So people continued to move to these metro areas, but they didn't move to the central city or the urban core. Instead, they moved to the suburban periphery. Again, this is like the donut effect, right? That people aren't moving to that middle. I think this is really remarkable. We also discuss in the paper some really fascinating trends and how these big Texas cities were an outlier nationally. New York, LA, Chicago were seeing declines in their population during the pandemic, whereas these big Texas cities continued to grow. So it's a very in some ways a similar pattern in Texas of the donut effect, but also a different pattern in just continued movement to metro areas. Just where within metro areas people were moving was changing. Well, the question is why? And as we discussed in the report, we think that remote work contributed to these changes in where people were moving and why they were moving. So what this is showing is among people who either stayed within their state or people who moved states, how many were working from home among people who were prime age workers? So prime age here is 20 to 54 for what it's worth. All right, so what this is showing is a couple of patterns. The first thing is this big increase in the share of all people who are working from home. Right, so we see just a run up in 2020 that continues in 2021. Lots of people began working from home, spending lots of time on Zoom, as we're glad you are today. Another pattern that we see here is that movers are more likely than stayers to be working at home all years, and then had bigger increases during the pandemic. So this is probably due to differences in the types of people that they are and the types of jobs that they have. The third thing, really, as we discussed in the report, is the likelihood that Texas's low cost of living and its many amenities may have been particularly appealing to people who work at home. Now, the data are somewhat small, so it's hard to exactly know what's going on and why, and I think Ishan can speculate more informatively on this than we can, but certainly the data are consistent with Texas attracting people who can work at home at least some of the time. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Pia to talk about the benefits of migration to Texas.
I have to unmute myself. Thanks, Madeline. That was great. If I can add one comment to sort of Madeline's part on this is that I know another reason that people moved during the pandemic, moved to Texas, I think was an additional reason, was that lockdowns lifted earlier here. And so we reopened schools, for example, in the fall of 2020. Public schools in states like California, I think, remained closed that entire school year, 2020-21. And so with the lockdowns being lifted earlier, I think is another contribution to maybe why people moved around more and moved here more. So great. So let's talk a little bit about sort of, what are the implications of migration to Texas? And I put benefits here. We don't talk a lot about the cost of migration. There are certainly costs as well, especially if you look at how housing prices have risen or the clogging of infrastructure, that type of thing. There's certainly some downsides of large and rapid population growth. And so we can maybe tackle some of that in the Q&A. But let's talk about benefits just from a couple of perspectives. The first is that migrants, if we look at the age profile of migrants, they tend to be prime working age. So you can see the Texas population here in this age pyramid on, in red, and we can see the movers to Texas in blue, and you can just see how they're concentrated really in their 20s and 30s. And so that means that, basically when they come here, they're moving in most cases straight into the workforce. And that's, of course, so they tend not to be old and they tend not to be young in general. And so that's definitely beneficial for a rapidly growing economy that's confronting, other bottlenecks to growth, as in employers tell us they have difficulty hiring and so forth. The other benefit of migration is that we tend to not get, migrants are not carbon copies of the people that live here. And so they tend to be complementary in many cases to the existing workforce. And this chart here, which is really about the occupations of migrants and how they differ from the Texas population, I think is informative. So the blue bars here are the Texas population and the share in each occupation listed at the bottom of the chart. And the red are the domestic immigrants. So if we just look at the domestic immigrants in red and compared to the Texas population, we see that domestic immigrants are more likely to be managers of companies, for example. They're significantly more likely to be STEM workers, so working in science, technology, engineering, and math occupations. They're slightly more likely to be in healthcare. And so all those, in that sense, they're sort of complementing or easing some of the bottlenecks, the difficulty hiring in those occupations where there's obviously a big need. Especially if you look at STEM workers, for example, that's sort of describing to us what's happening with all the tech workers that are moving to Austin, for example, and that really happened it was happening before the pandemic, but a trend that really accelerated in the pandemic, and something that Yichen really talks about in his work, and that's fascinating. Let's also look at the purple bar. That's international in-migrants. So what occupations are they flowing into? They're also slightly more likely than the existing population to be managers. They're significantly more likely to be STEM workers also, like the domestic migrants are. And then, but on sort of the low skill side, they're more likely to be in production occupations like manufacturing and in the service sector. So we see, especially, if we look, we're not going to show education, composition of these migrant flows at the moment, but they're very highly skilled when they come domestically, and when they come from international sources, they're kind of divided. They come at the extremes of the education distribution. They're either highly skilled with a bachelor's degree or higher, or they have either a high school diploma or not even that. And so, but they go into the workforce and they're contributing, as we're showing you on this occupation chart. So what happens with this in-migration is that the Texas pace of job growth is higher than that of the US, and significantly higher. Now, we always remind, when we go out from the Fed and we give these regional economy speeches, we remind people that the big reason that Texas can grow so much faster than the US, about 1 percentage point faster per year in job growth than the US, the only reason for that is because of in-migration. And so here in the blue line, you can see we've kind of indexed the employment data here in the blue line for Texas and the red line for the US, just so you can see, starting, even from the last 10 years or so, you can just see there's just this huge job growth premium in Texas. And that really comes about from this in-migration. We would not be able to sustain this job growth premium, this faster job growth, without the in-migration of workers, both from domestic sources and international sources. So it's very significant. It's part of the sauce here. The magic that makes sort of this Texas exceptionalism is really about bringing more people here. The other thing, when I show that slide, I get one of the most common reactions, less now, but maybe 10 years ago or so, when I showed that slide, is the response I would get is, yeah, but Texas creates a lot of low-skilled jobs or minimum wage jobs people don't want, but they're not creating high-skilled jobs. So actually, when people started asking that, we actually looked into it, and we did this exercise that I'm showing you here. We divided up the workforce into wage quartiles, and we're starting in 2006. And we freeze those wage quartiles in real terms over time. And then we see how much of the job creation is occurring in each wage quartile. And we compare Texas to the rest of the US. And so you can see that Texas is creating more jobs in the second, the third, and the fourth quartile. In fact, there's faster job growth in every one of those. So we're creating more jobs at the high skilled end, in the middle skilled end. And interestingly, the last time we updated this chart, we found that actually in the low wage quartile, we're actually losing jobs in the low wage quartile. And that's true for the US, to a lesser extent true for Texas, but still that quartile is shrinking. So it's not the case that what's being created in Texas are low wage jobs. In fact, if you look over time, immigration, as I mentioned earlier, it's become more and more high skilled over time, and we're pulling less from Latin America and more from China and India, where we're getting so many of the people that are STEM workers and come with advanced degrees. The other thing we wanted to show you was, we have faster job creation in Texas, and that's partly a response to the fact that we have more in-migration. But we also have a faster rate of business formation. And so we showed that in our last report. Madeline and we used census data from the business dynamics survey. Is that right, Madeline? So you can show it with that survey. It's a little bit dated, though. It comes out with a lag. And so here we're showing you business formation, which is much more timely. And it's impressive how both in the US and in Texas, business formation, these are applications to start new businesses, actually, how the incredible growth in business formation in the pandemic. as there's this huge reallocation in the economy away from sort of certain sectors that didn't, that were hurt or harmed by the pandemic economy, and then certain sectors that benefited from it. And so we saw this big reallocation of resources from one end of the economy to the other. And that resulted in this just a skyrocketing rate of business formation. Texas has slightly higher rates of business formation in general than the nation. I think that's probably a reflection of the fact that we have, more business friendly regulation, and probably slightly lower taxes on business in most cases. And so we also have a much less regulated labor market, which probably also makes it easier to start businesses. But we didn't want to leave the business piece out of this, because we've been talking about people migrating to Texas, but we also, in prior work, we've shown that Texas is also number one in the migration of businesses. And then here we can see we're also, exceed the national average in terms of the rate of business formation within the state. So those are also significant pieces of the migration puzzle, and the reason that Texas is able to grow faster. I think we can conclude, just to briefly summarize and get to your questions. So for Texas, domestic migration sped up in the pandemic. And the fact that domestic migration sped up made that actually compensated for slower international migration. Of course, in 2022, as Madeline described, sort of both of these were surging. And so we actually had a near record year of net migration into Texas in 2022. And then remote work certainly contributed to where people located in Texas once they got here. The fact that they went to these large metropolitan areas, but did not settle in the urban core to the extent that they had prior to the pandemic, but in fact, they settled in suburbs, and to a certain extent, and Yichun has shown this, also smaller cities to a certain extent. And then what's the significance of all of this is that domestic and international migrants help Texas grow faster, and they fill gaps in the labor force, and they fill them, in real time. And so I think there's some real benefits in terms of economic growth from all this in migration. And I think we continue to reap the benefits from that as we go forward. But of course, again, I mentioned there are certainly some costs, with growing as well. And we can talk about that in Q&A. That's all the prepared remarks we had. I did want to turn to Yichun, because before we go to questions, just because Yichun, we cite him a lot in our report, and because he's done really, he's working on the frontier of these issues and writing really excellent papers. And so we were really curious to hear his remarks.
Oh, thanks. Thanks for having me here. And Madeline and Pia had summarized the migration trend really, really well. And so I just, because I've done a few research projects on, both working from home and working from home's effect on migration patterns during COVID, I think I was just going to talk a little bit about some of the, instead of talking about the patterns again, I'll focus more on the consequences, right? Some of the implications of these migration waves and working from home. So I really have 3 points that I want to mention, very short points. So the first is about, how is migration of jobs and employers, and how is that related to migration of residents, and how in Texas, how should we think about it? Right. So the way I think about working from home is that working from home sort of decoupled workers, where workers can live and the location of their employers. And so this decoupling led to a strong net movement of residents to suburbs and lower density metros where the cost of housing is low, right? So that's what was happening. And then the movement of people certainly brought a lot of non-tradable service jobs, such as retail and food service jobs, to where people are moving to, right? And Texas benefited a lot from that, especially the suburbs of the large Texas metros. But for the sectors that adopted virtual work a lot, like professional service jobs, like tech, finance, and other white-collar jobs, these jobs didn't necessarily follow where people move, right? Precisely because of working from home. And so it's a little bit trickier to think about job gain and migration for those sectors specifically. And so the way I think about this is that for those sectors, remote work and virtual technology sort of removed the location constraint that used to sort of lock these firms in place before the pandemic. And so they gained this location freedom due to remote work. And as a result, states like California and New York suddenly lost many employers and jobs to states like Florida and Texas. And sort of we're benefiting from that. But also, because of working from home, right? We have to pay attention to where these high-skilled professional jobs are landing in Texas, right? It's actually, they're not sort of chasing residents, exactly following residents. It turns out that the incoming firms in those sectors are very geographically concentrated. And so we found that 93% of the professional service jobs added in Texas since the beginning of the pandemic were only just in the 10 counties. So that was very kind of dramatic finding. And so we sort of want to highlight the importance that we sort of separately think about the job gain in the non-tradable sectors and these professional service sectors. So the highly concentrated growth in professional service sector jobs may have increased the regional economic disparities within the state. So that was my first sort of the first point that I wanted to make. The second point is many researchers have, so the second point that I want to make is about this migration's implication on housing supply and future cost of housing over the long run. So many researchers have documented that this migration wave toward low density during the pandemic has really profoundly shifted the nation's population towards locations where land tend to be less constrained and land use regulations tend to be more loose. And so to put in other words, the pandemic and working from home sort of pushed Americans more to locations where it is on average easier to build new housing. And so while over the long run, when people are moving, when the migration is surging, it could create a spike in housing cost. But many researchers now has noticed that is predicting sort of the shift in population toward less constrained area may mean that over the longer run, housing costs could have been somewhat mitigated. So that's the second point that I wanted to make. And the third and the last point is, suburbanization and working from home, has a lot of benefits, and particularly for us, right, for Texas. However, one potential downside of working from home and sort of empty urban center is that in-person interactions at work could have been reduced. And research have shown that workplace in dense places with lots of people, produce great productivity benefit. And this is mainly because, when you put people together, they interact, they share knowledge, they learn from each other, and they solve problems collectively. And working from home sort of weakens that kind of activity. And also, besides working, right, urban centers themselves, these are also where a lot of the quote unquote third places are located. And these are the places where people socialize, interact, and build networks. And so the setback of these type of city centers and urban neighborhood could potentially weaken those activities as well. So I really think that as sort of observers of these changes, we should not dismiss these setbacks that are experienced by city centers and sort of dense places. So those are the 3 points that I want to make, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Yichen. I have to follow. Can I follow up with the first question? So Yichen, your work does show that productivity in firms suffers when more people are working from home. Basically, like you said, they don't gather around the water cooler, they're not in meetings, they don't actively collaborate as much as when they're, in the office. So wouldn't that tell you then that this work from home thing is going to sort of run its course, maybe expire? We're going to return back to sort of the office equilibrium that we had before the pandemic?
Oh, yeah, this is a very good question. So I actually, in our research, we show that it's really the fully remote work that start, like you need some interaction with your colleagues, right? Like, I think hybrid work might actually solve this problem to some extent. And so that's one. And so you don't need to go to the office every day to have this kind of human capital, right? So that's one. And the other is that actually remote work actually has productivity. There's a flip side of the coin, because with remote work, very productive firms now are able to hire broadly, right? They're no longer constrained by geography, right? Somehow you have to get the worker to live here, and that might drive up the housing costs. And some people might find it very costly to live close to your firm, right? And so now with remote technology, you can sort of break that constraint. But there's another benefit. So I think firms are sort of trying to navigate, right, the pros and cons between these benefits and the costs. And I think as firms more and more internalize like this, I feel like in the beginning of the pandemic, some firms just didn't realize the loss from lacking physical interactions. And I feel like as they realize that more and more, they're going to adjust their policies.
Yeah, that makes sense. And that's a good point about, hybrid versus fully remote. And so, yeah, that's really interesting. Thank you so much, Yichen. Madeline, do you want to go to the question in the Q&A, or did you want to make a comment?
Oh, of course I want to make a comment, but it is a great question, so I will save my comment, which is going to be about weak ties. But I think Bob Elhart, thank you very much for this question, and I encourage anyone else online to bring us questions, comments. We welcome it. So Bob asks about whether the patterns that we saw in international immigration were impacted by the Trump administration's immigration policies. Short answer, yes, absolutely. Longer answer is it's somewhat more complicated in that I think we forget that even though Trump was elected in 2016, he didn't take office till 2017. And his election was a big surprise to many observers, certainly. So I think that some of the drop in international migration predecede, I'm not sure what the right word is there, was before Trump took office, and indeed even before he won election. So you have to think what happened globally as to why fewer people would be coming to the United States even as early as 2016. And so part of it, I think, would be that it certainly wasn't the U.S. economy being weak. The U.S. economy was doing very well during this period, but that in a lot of important source countries, things were also going relatively well. And that's something, Pia, you might want to speculate on. But then later on, of course, there were many changes in immigration policy that made it much more difficult for many people to enter the United States, less appealing to do so. What's particularly interesting is whether people who were already here wanted to stay or not during this period. And there were certainly continued high levels of deportations. There were very high levels of deportations already under the Obama administration. Those continued and shifted in some ways how they were occurring and where they were occurring during the Trump administration. But I don't think we necessarily saw a mass exodus under the Trump administration, particularly not a mass voluntary exodus, in part because the economy remains so strong.
So there's one thing. So we wrote a blog a few years ago about the drop in migration, in particular looking at the drop in international students. And so the initial drop, we were quite surprised. I mean, it was definitely Chinese students are part of that decline. And so I think with all the rhetoric around the Trump administration and so forth, they probably did dissuade many Chinese students from coming to the United States. But the other thing that we saw in the data, though, was a big drop in foreign students from Saudi Arabia and the Middle East. And it was actually the oil bust in 2015, 2016. And you would only know this if you're working in Texas. So it was a terrible time for the energy industry. And I guess oil prices went down they were $30, less than $35. And so with the oil bust, actually, the Saudis and other Middle Eastern countries that send a lot of their own, students overseas to study abroad, and they actually curtailed those opportunities as a result of the oil bust. So that was some of the initial, at least as it pertained to international students. But then certainly the Trump administration followed up with, and there's data on this in terms of things like they bogged down the processing of paperwork. Like they put in twice as many requests for evidence for H-1B visa applications, for example. They put a health insurance health coverage requirement on green card applicants to prevent them from becoming public charges. They had a number of sort of paperwork, kind of regulatory behind the scenes stuff they were doing to slow, to gum up the works. And that worked because they really did slow green card processing and H-1B visa processing quite significantly.
And there was a huge drop in refugees that has really persisted. It's going to take a long time to reverse that. Part of it is I think that this whole international architecture of how we admit people, how we process their applications and so on, got largely reduced under the Trump administration, then just shut down during the pandemic. And so trying to resurrect something that was already in decay for a number of years is going to take time. If the administration is committed to increasing arrivals from abroad, it's going to take quite a while to ramp it all back up.
Absolutely. So here's a question from Hiroki, our friend here at the Tower Center. So that's awesome. Even in Texas, sometimes the political discourse of international migration is negative. Is there any negative economic impact of the negative discourse for the Texas economy and for business through policymaking? I think that Madeline should take this question.
Well, clearly I am not as up on what's going on in Texas, but boy, things in Florida are interesting and perhaps in many ways parallel what has happened in Texas. And you never know what the counterfactual is, what would have happened absent the rhetoric that we see. But certainly the very strong numbers in international inflows in Texas that we see in the data in 2022 suggest that if the rhetoric was slowing things down, it's unbelievable what it would, what it would have been otherwise. And part of it is, of course, where Texas is positioned, that it is on the border with Mexico, where huge numbers of people have been entering in or trying to enter in recent years. And this is all with Title 42 still in place. The pandemic is not officially over until May of 2023 somehow. That's going to magically happen next month. But what will happen then to border crossings and attempted border crossings is likely to be truly astonishing. And not all of those migrants intend to stay in Texas if that's where they cross, but many of them, I think, do see that there are jobs readily available. They find people from their home country or people, who are willing to start setting them up with a life in the United States, and they end up, in many cases, staying in Texas.
I mean, for people who don't follow the data, what Madeline is talking about, if you look at the border encounters, what used to be called border apprehensions along the southwest border, the last 2 years, they reached record levels. We've never seen anything like it. 2.5 million, I think 2.7 million encounters with individuals. Some of those are repeat, encounters, the same person getting caught twice. But these are numbers we've never even seen anything close to it. So the people on the border are dealing with, just an absolute, huge increase in asylum seekers, mostly some undocumented immigration, but just a lot of asylum seekers, complicated cases with a lot of humanitarian repercussions. All right, great. Hiroki's next question. What kind of infrastructure is needed to keep the migration to suburban areas around Texas's big cities? So what are the infrastructure needs? Maybe Yichen, you can talk about those.
Yeah, the infrastructure, it definitely need more infrastructure, but I think infrastructure need to be evaluated case by case, right? Like you have to consider the cost and benefits of each community. Personally, I'm an urban economist, and I would propose probably more density, like build more compact suburban neighborhoods so that you can sort of exploit the economy of scale more efficiently. And I'm not very sure about trains because in a sparsely populated area, trains might be very expensive. So buses, buses with dedicated lane, but that's kind of we can find another time to talk about that. Yeah, that's kind of my reaction to that.
Yeah, no, that's excellent. And we saw we talking to one of the very famous regional and urban economists, I guess you would call him. Now I'm going to blank on his name just because he was just here speaking to us. But
Ed
his,
Glazer.
I'm sorry?
Ed Glazer, right?
Ed Glazer, yeah, thank you, Chen. But yeah, his big thing was, how expensive trains are, and trains are not a reasonable, option, and that for infrastructure needs, as far as transportation is concerned, yeah, exactly as you said, Yuchen, buses are a lot more cost effective, and they're a lot more flexible in where they go, and anyway, so that's a good point. And I think also, yeah, I mean, school teachers, we're seeing now that the lack of teachers, especially in smaller and rural school districts, actually are pushing school districts to move to 4-day school weeks, and so which obviously transfers some of that burden of childcare onto the parents. And so we're definitely seeing repercussions of all this in-migration and all this growth on infrastructure and staffing of public services. But I will say also in Texas, they kind of have a built-in growth mindset. Like if you meet with the water people that are planning for the water supply, they've got it planned out for the next 50 years. And they're assuming that growth will continue at the current pace, and we're going to have enough water in 50 years. So I do appreciate the growth mindset of the people around the state. That are not, because you can go to other states and other countries and they're very averse to growth. And I think in Texas, they kind of welcome growth. Of course, some of the ways they welcome growth, like toll roads, for example, not super popular. People don't tend to like toll roads, but that's one way to get a road built in record time, is by passing those charges on to the user. Madeline?
Oh, I was going to say, my mother lives up in Oklahoma, and there you see billboards posted by towns in Texas trying to recruit teachers. And so I think one thing that Texas has really strong support for its public K-12 schools, I think, and maintaining that support and putting resources there, I think is important to a lot of people. But with that, let's go on to Margarita's question. And I'll let the Texans answer that one.
Margarita's asking, given these impressive immigration numbers, how are Texas residents responding? Do you think their reactions might limit or further increase the number of people coming to Texas in the future? I think, in general, Texans have been great about welcoming people to their state. I know when I got here, they said, are you from Texas? And I would say, well, no. And they would say, well, that's okay. You got here as soon as you could. I felt very welcome when I came here. When I moved to California, and I love California, but they were not nearly as, they didn't have that kind of, because they definitely thought they were full and they didn't really want more people. So that was the sense I got. I don't know if Texas is heading that direction. I think we are starting to see some pain with the increase in housing prices, especially in the pandemic. They went up very fast. And so now we're actually, I think, definitely in Dallas and Austin, a lot less affordable than the national average in terms of our house prices. And the problem in Texas is that, we, in terms of the state, lives off of two really tax sources in general, or specifically is the sales tax and the property tax. And so when our house prices go up, that's very nice if you're selling, I guess. But if you're living there and you have to pay that property tax bill, which is going up, by $10,000, $20,000, $30,000 a year, that's really hard. So I think, yeah, the rubber is probably starting to meet the road on growth. And I think especially with the rise in living costs. You wanna take the next one, Yuchen?
Oh, is there anything you have explored regarding the differences in migration trend between men and women? I think the conditions of female mobility are more constrained than those of male mobility due to the presence of children. What do you think about it? I haven't looked by gender, so I can't really speculate.
No, I mean, internationally, we've looked at it. We know men are more likely to move internationally, but I don't think, Madeline, we've ever looked at the gender composition of domestic migration, right?
Right. I think what we do know is that people tend to move kind of in their 20s, early 30s. I don't know that I've ever seen evidence on gender differences. That's really interesting. What we know internationally is that there's been a big kind of long-term increase in women moving internationally. That it used, if you went back a generation, it really was men who moved, and they moved to work. And we've seen increasing numbers of women, and then within the last decade, unaccompanied children entering the United States. And of course, the humanitarian situation involving these children is very difficult. And in part, it's, I think, I'm going to say rational, reasonable response by their families to very bad conditions at home and to U.S. policies. And so it's going to be a hard problem to address and very heartbreaking.
I think even with those trends, and those trends are obviously, that's correct, what Madeline's saying, but there's still, I think the majority of border crossers, if you think of the Southwest border, are still men though, right?
I think that's true, but the increasing kind of trend of women has
the trend,
and this is a long-term
right.
trend.
Yeah,
but it would be interesting to know about domestic migration.
Yeah, good research idea.
Yeah.
Well, Hiroki, I'm not touching that question. Your last question, Hiroki.
There's no evidence yet. Same thing for Florida, let me just say. So what I found really interesting that Yi-Chen talked about was the evidence on businesses moving, that Pia and I tend to think much more about people moving than about businesses moving. And so it's interesting to think about whether there are differences in moving a business headquarters or business operations, even if the headquarters stay in one place, to move where the actual work gets done and therefore where the jobs are, as a whether that differs from the regular movement of people. And so another thing that maybe Yi-Chen could just talk more generally about that.
Yeah, it's always, especially now, it's always tricky to do that. I mean, it used to be less tricky. Now it's a lot trickier because now people and where people are and where the businesses are actually different, right? So it really, when you look at jobs, it really matters, when whether you're talking about jobs based on your employer's location or where you are, right? So nowadays, because of working from home, lots of people who, work for California companies are living in Arizona or Nevada. So that makes it a little trickier. And basically what my research recently have found was, this businesses, especially professional service business where people can work from home, is like increasing dramatically in Texas. And they're sort of only like in Collin County, Travis County, Williamson County, like they're really concentrated in these very few places. So yeah.
Thank you, Yi-Chen. Jenny, should I turn it? Are you going to close us out, Jenny?
Yes, well, thank you. This was, I know that I have some questions of my own, but we're out of time. But I want to thank you, Pia, Madeline, and Yi-Chen. Thank you so much for this webinar today. I hope everybody enjoyed it. And yes, we will. I will say the same thing Madeline said. Go online to smu.edu/Texas Mexico, read the report, because you will find even more information there by their research, and follow us also on Twitter at SMU Texas Mexico. Leave questions there. If you have questions for our experts, engage in a conversation there. There's also space to do that there as well. Pia, Madeline, Yi-Chen, thank you so much. And thank you, everybody. We'll see you in the next one.
Okay, thanks, Jenny.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.